Have you ever felt called to do something greater than you ever imagined you were capable of? Something that would demand all your courage, faith, and perhaps even your life? Well, Nehemiah experienced exactly that. Picture having a dream so big, so urgent, yet not knowing where to begin. Nehemiah was in a comfortable position, but something stirred him, something he could no longer ignore. He saw his city in ruins, his people suffering, and one question echoed in his mind. What can I do to change this? Now imagine yourself standing before a powerful king, asking not only for permission to leave your position, but also to rebuild a destroyed city and save your people. What would you do? Would the king grant your request? And more importantly, would Nehemiah have the strength to face the challenges ahead? Get ready, because what you're about to hear is a story of courage, faith, and a leader determined not to let circumstances define his destiny. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. If you believe these teachings can transform lives, like this video and share it so more people can hear this story and be inspired. Nehemiah, a man of faith, was living hundreds of miles away from his homeland. He resided in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, where he held a position of great responsibility, cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. His job seemed simple at first glance, but it was a position of immense trust. He tasted the king's food and drink to ensure they weren't poisoned. Although the role appeared safe and comfortable, Nehemiah wasn't the type to settle easily. He felt there was something more important he was meant to do, but he didn't yet know what. When he learned about the destruction of Jerusalem, his homeland, something within him was deeply shaken. News from a brother who had just returned from Jerusalem devastated him. The city lay in ruins, its walls destroyed and its gates burned. Hearing this, Nehemiah's heart filled with sorrow, but also a burning desire to act. He knew the people of Israel were suffering, and his beloved city, Jerusalem, was abandoned. It was a difficult moment. As the king's cupbearer, Nehemiah lived in the luxurious Persian court, far from his people. But the pain of seeing his homeland in ruins outweighed any comfort he had. Nehemiah knew he had to do something. But what? He wasn't a great military leader, nor did he have the resources to rebuild the city on his own. He was just an ordinary man in a modest position, driven by love for his land and his people. With this heavy burden on his heart, Nehemiah began to pray. He prayed like never before, seeking guidance and strength to know what to do. He fully committed himself to the cause of rebuilding Jerusalem. But one doubt lingered. Could he truly make a difference? Could his faith move mountains? For days, Nehemiah prayed, fasted, and sought an answer. Finally, God gave him a clear sign. Nehemiah felt peace in his heart and a clear direction. He was to ask King Artaxerxes for permission to travel to Jerusalem and begin the reconstruction. He didn't know how, but he felt God was calling him to this mission. The request wouldn't be simple. King Artaxerxes was a powerful monarch, and any request could be met with suspicion. The risk was immense. Nehemiah knew he was putting his life and position on the line. Asking the king to allow him to leave for Jerusalem could be seen as betrayal. The king could easily refuse and, worse, punish him severely. But Nehemiah didn't hesitate. He knew he was being led by God. With courage in his heart, he entered the presence of King Artaxerxes and made the request that would change his life and the lives of many others. The conversation was tense at first, but when the king asked the reason for his sadness, Nehemiah didn't hold back. "My king, the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins," Nehemiah said, his voice trembling. "I need to go there and rebuild it. The people are suffering and the city needs help." The king, upon hearing these words, paused in silence. Nehemiah knew everything depended on the king's reaction. And then, to his surprise, the king granted his request. Not only that, but the king also offered letters of safe passage and resources to ensure the mission's success. Nehemiah could hardly believe what had just happened. He now had permission to return to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding the city. The plan was taking shape, and Nehemiah knew it was time to act. As he prepared to depart, Nehemiah reflected on the great challenge ahead. He knew this journey wouldn't be easy. Many obstacles would arise, both from enemies and from the internal struggles of his city. But despite the fear, one thing was certain: he was determined to move forward. And so, with God's support and the king's permission, Nehemiah began his journey back to his homeland, unaware that he was about to face challenges requiring all his faith and courage. As Nehemiah traveled to Jerusalem, he knew he was about to face unexpected enemies who wouldn't want to see the city restored. Would he be able to convince the people and local leaders to join him in the reconstruction? And what else would he encounter upon his arrival? Stay tuned, as this video reveals how Nehemiah faced his first obstacles and began earning the trust of the Jews in Jerusalem. Did you know that every time you like a video like this, you're helping spread biblical teachings to more people? Subscribe to continue being part of this mission. Nehemiah finally arrived in Jerusalem. The atmosphere in the city was heavy, and a sense of desolation lingered everywhere. Ruins were all around, with broken walls and burned gates. What had once been a center of faith and worship was now consumed by chaos. Yet Nehemiah did not let the scene discourage him. He understood that his mission was greater than any difficulty he might face. He was there with a purpose, and nothing would distract him. As soon as he arrived, Nehemiah realized that news of his presence had already spread. He quickly met with the local Jewish leaders to explain his mission. He understood that rebuilding the city would not be an easy task. Jerusalem was not only physically destroyed, but spiritually broken. The people were disheartened, and many had lost hope of ever seeing their city restored. However, Nehemiah, with unshakable faith, was determined to inspire them to rise again. While trying to motivate the leaders and the people, Nehemiah encountered an immediate challenge: resistance from neighboring rulers and even some among the population. Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite, were two local leaders who felt deeply threatened by Nehemiah's presence and mission. They saw the rebuilding of Jerusalem as a danger to their own power and interests, and were unwilling to allow Nehemiah to succeed without putting up a fight. "Who do you think you are, Nehemiah? What right do you have to come here and try to change everything we've established?" mocked Sanballat upon hearing Nehemiah's plans. Tobiah, on the other hand, openly showed his disdain. They began spreading rumors and discrediting Nehemiah among the people, trying to undermine the trust he was building. Nehemiah, however, was not intimidated. He knew that such resistance was part of the journey, but his mission did not depend on Sanballat or Tobiah's approval. His trust was in God and the divine calling to restore Jerusalem. "Our God will give us success," Nehemiah declared to his companions, emphasizing that the battle was not just against visible enemies, but also against spiritual forces seeking to derail their mission. Nehemiah understood that he could not face this opposition alone. He gathered the local leaders and encouraged them to unite in the work of rebuilding. Every available hand was needed to raise the walls, and Nehemiah knew that collective effort would be the key to success. He divided the work into sections, assigning specific areas to different groups so that everyone had a direct responsibility in the reconstruction. Yet the opposition didn't stop. Sanballat and Tobiah, feeling increasingly challenged, escalated their attacks. They attempted to intimidate Nehemiah with open threats and even sent messages to King Artaxerxes, trying to discredit Nehemiah by accusing him of harboring political ambitions, as if he were aiming to become the king of Jerusalem. Of course, these were lies, but their intent was clear: to destabilize the work and halt Jerusalem's restoration. Despite this, Nehemiah remained focused. He knew that if he allowed every threat and accusation to affect him, the entire project would fail. Thus, he sought refuge in God. With courage and faith, Nehemiah and the workers continued to build the walls, even under constant pressure from their enemies. Determined, Nehemiah didn't give an inch. He kept working, but also praying and staying vigilant. At any sign of an attack, he and his men were ready to defend themselves, holding a sword in one hand and tools in the other. As the work progressed, Nehemiah faced internal problems among his own people. Some complained about injustices within the Jewish community. A significant number of poor families were being oppressed by wealthy Jews, who charged high interest rates and unfairly collected debts. Nehemiah could not overlook this. He called a large assembly and confronted the leaders who were exploiting their own brothers. The situation needed to be addressed, and Nehemiah once again stepped up as a just leader, caring not only about the walls, but also about the well-being of the people. "You are oppressing your own brothers," Nehemiah declared firmly. "This cannot continue. Let us act with justice and mercy, or our mission will fail before it even begins." This kind of leadership, combining courage, wisdom, and compassion, began to unite the people even more. Nehemiah made sure everyone returned what they had unjustly taken and started to rebuild trust among the families. The reconstruction effort gained new momentum. Seeing Nehemiah's commitment, the people came together with renewed strength, and the city began to take shape again. The external threat, however, did not disappear. Sanballat and Tobiah, realizing that their attempts to sabotage the project were failing, launched more direct threats and even tried to deceive Nehemiah with false peace proposals. But Nehemiah was aware of their traps. He knew they were only trying to distract him from his main goal. "I don't have time to listen to your lies and negotiations," Nehemiah responded firmly. "Our mission is clear, and we will continue to do what God has called us to do." With that, Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem pressed on with their work, knowing that despite the obstacles and threats, they were fulfilling a greater purpose. The rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls was not just a physical task, it was a fight for the people's identity and faith. As the walls began to take shape, Nehemiah knew there were still many challenges ahead, but the greatest one was yet to come. With enemies joining forces and internal pressures mounting, the true test of faith was about to unfold. Next, we will see how Nehemiah faced one of the greatest dilemmas of his leadership and how he maintained the unity of the people in the face of overwhelming adversity. Did you know that every time you like a video like this, you're helping to spread the teachings of the Bible to more people? Subscribe to continue being part of this mission. As the rebuilding of the walls progressed, Nehemiah and his people were finally beginning to feel a sense of progress. The large wooden doors were being placed in the gates, and the collapsed walls were starting to take shape. The people of Jerusalem, once discouraged, were now working with determination and hope, an energy that had not been seen in a long time. But the threats from Sanballat and Tobiah were far from over. In one last effort to stop Nehemiah, they decided to join forces with other regional powers. Meanwhile, Nehemiah was not only concerned with the physical construction of the walls, he knew he needed to ensure that the people were spiritually strengthened to face what was to come. But the opposition was becoming increasingly hard to ignore. As the work progressed, the enemies began to organize. They realized that the best way to harm Nehemiah was not to attack him directly, but to try to divert him from his purpose. To achieve this, they began to cast bait, creating distractions that could destabilize him. One day, Nehemiah received a letter from one of his craftiest enemies, Shemaiah, requesting an urgent meeting. The text said that Nehemiah should hide in the temple of Jerusalem as the enemies were at the gates and planned to kill him. The message seemed legitimate, but Nehemiah, who knew the strategy of his enemies, immediately realized that it was a trap. They were trying to force him to abandon his post and hide, showing weakness before the people. Nehemiah, firm in his decision, refused the meeting, and instead of fearing, he strengthened himself in his faith. "I will not do this," he said to himself. "If I hide now, the people will lose confidence and everything we have built so far will be in vain." He knew that the mission God had entrusted to him was not just to rebuild the physical walls, but also to maintain the spiritual integrity of the people. He could not allow his actions to be manipulated by fear. Furthermore, Nehemiah had the clear perception that the forces trying to hinder him were not just fighting against him, but against God's very purpose for his life and for Jerusalem. The resistance of the enemies was not merely a political struggle, but a spiritual battle. As the people continued to work on the walls, the leader prepared for the next move. Knowing that the enemies were gathering and plotting a great conspiracy, Nehemiah decided to intensify the vigilance. He began to divide the work more strategically. Half of the people would work, while the other half stood guard. Each worker had his sword in hand, ready to defend the walls and their families if necessary. The work did not stop, but security was prioritized. But the tension continued to grow. Each new day, the enemies became bolder. Sanballat, who could not accept that God's people were prospering, began sending new messages, more direct and aggressive. He wanted Nehemiah to come down from the wall to talk with him. They tried various ways to distract him, including threats disguised as peace negotiations. But Nehemiah knew very well that these enemies were not there to make deals. They were simply trying to weaken him emotionally and spiritually. He, on his part, remained firm and unafraid. He knew that his mission did not depend on agreements or alliances with those who did not believe in the same God. Nehemiah's confidence was in something much greater than his abilities or human forces. He trusted in divine power to protect the people and ensure the success of the work. Meanwhile, the opposition intensified. Sanballat and Tobiah, no longer able to rely on slander and gossip, began to launch an even more aggressive campaign, spreading lies about Nehemiah, trying to make him appear as someone who wanted to rise. As a political leader, their efforts were desperate, but Nehemiah did not give in. He did not stray from his mission, nor did he allow the lies to divert him from his focus. "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down," Nehemiah declared firmly. He knew that any deviation now could cost dearly, not only for him, but for the entire people. Tension was at its peak. The threats continued, but the construction moved forward. Each new layer of stone placed in the wall symbolized not only resistance against the external enemies, but also against the doubt and fear that tried to dominate the hearts of the people. Nehemiah led with unwavering faith, reminding everyone that despite everything, they were fulfilling the mission given by God. "We will not stop until Jerusalem is restored," he would say. Encouraging everyone with his words of strength, Nehemiah's perseverance was a direct reflection of his trust in God. He not only resisted external threats, but also faced internal doubts, constantly reminding himself and the people that the battle was being fought on two fronts, physically and spiritually. With each passing day, the wall grew stronger and the people's hope was renewed. With the wall nearly complete, Nehemiah knew the enemies were preparing a final blow. The pressure was mounting, and now more than ever, the people needed courage to face what was coming. At a crucial moment, Nehemiah would need to trust more than ever in his God and the leaders around him. What would happen if the people failed now, when they were so close to victory? In the next video, we will see how Nehemiah faces his greatest challenge yet, and how his faith will be the key to overcoming what seemed impossible. As the walls of Jerusalem began to take shape, the challenges were far from over. Nehemiah knew that the physical work was nearly complete, but the real battle was still ahead. The external threats were nothing compared to the internal challenges he would face. His enemies, frustrated by the progress of the work, now decided to attack in a different way. If they had previously tried to discredit Nehemiah with slander and gossip, now they were planning something more direct, a large-scale sabotage. The pressure was at its peak. Sanballat and Tobiah, along with other leaders from the region, devised a plan to stop Nehemiah and his people from building. They knew that if they could destabilize the people of Jerusalem emotionally, the rebuilding of the walls would become impossible. Therefore, they started spreading even more threatening rumors. They claimed there was a conspiracy among the Jewish leaders and the neighboring powers, suggesting that Nehemiah's goal was to declare himself king and overthrow the Persian Empire. Panic began to spread among many of the workers. Nehemiah, as always, was attentive. He knew that if the people were shaken by distrust and fear, the work would come to a halt. So he acted decisively. Upon hearing the threats and rumors, Nehemiah did not give in to the pressure. Instead, he gathered the leaders of the people and strengthened them with words of courage. He reminded them that the work they were doing was not just physical labor, but an act of faith and obedience to God. What Nehemiah understood, and what many did not at that moment, was that his fight was not against men, but against the spiritual forces that were trying to prevent the restoration of Jerusalem. He had realized that when fulfilling a divine purpose, difficulties are not just external obstacles, but also attacks on the spirit. Aware of this, Nehemiah prayed fervently. He asked God to give him wisdom to deal with this crisis and strength to resist the external temptations and pressures. The people, seeing their leader's firmness, began to respond as well. Those who had previously been shaken by the rumors were now more united than ever. Nehemiah had become not only the physical leader of the work, but also the spiritual leader of the reconstruction of Jerusalem. He knew that the work would not be completed without God's strength, and from this understanding, he encouraged everyone to dedicate themselves even more. The watch on the walls increased, and every man and woman was attentive not only to what was happening around them, but also to what was happening in their own hearts. Nehemiah's greatest test, however, was yet to come. Even with renewed spirit and the strength of the people restored, a final attack from the enemies could be devastating. One night, while they were in the midst of construction, a messenger arrived with alarming news. Sanballat and Tobiah had sent an army to attack Jerusalem and destroy the work before it could be completed. The threat was real and imminent. What would Nehemiah do now? The wall was almost finished, but the safety of the people was at risk. Nehemiah, instead of panicking, made a strategic decision. He knew that even with all the strength of Jerusalem, they still needed God's help. He ordered the people to prepare for battle, but also did something no one expected. He set up a plan for prayer and fasting, asking God to intervene and protect them. At first, many were hesitant. "How can we fight and pray at the same time?" they asked. But Nehemiah convinced them that, for the work to be completed, a joint effort was required, physical and spiritual labor. He ordered that the construction continue, but with a significant change. Half of the people would continue working on the walls, while the other half would prepare for battle. Everyone, however, would need to be armed with swords, ready to defend their homes, families, and the work of God. The people mobilized quickly, and what seemed like a great weakness actually became a symbol of strength. Every man there knew that their fight was not just for a wall of stones, but for their freedom, their faith, and their identity as God's people. The work was almost finished, but the battle for the safety of Jerusalem could not be postponed. And so, under Nehemiah's guidance, the city prepared for an imminent confrontation. But, despite the adversity, Nehemiah did not lose faith in God. "The hand of the Lord is with us," he kept repeating to the people. He knew that if God was with them, nothing could stop them from completing the task. As the people of Jerusalem prepared for the final clash with their enemies, an unexpected change occurred. The attack did not come in the way they had anticipated. But what would Nehemiah do when instead of a physical battle, he faced something even more challenging? What would happen when their trust in God was tested even more deeply? Find out what happens next as Nehemiah is called to make a decision that will forever change the future of Jerusalem. As the city of Jerusalem prepared for an imminent attack, Nehemiah found himself in a situation completely different from what he had expected. It was no longer a battle against an invading army, but an internal struggle within the community itself. The people were growing increasingly tired and demotivated, and some voices began to question the need to continue the work. The fear of a possible enemy attack had already spread, and the tension among the workers was starting to affect everyone's morale. At that moment, Nehemiah realized that the greatest threat to the work was not the army of Sanballat and Tobiah, but the distrust and fatigue among the Jews themselves. Their faith was being tested in an unexpected way. The workers, who had previously been motivated by their faith in God, were now overwhelmed by constant effort and the pressure from their enemies. Many began to doubt whether the wall would ever be completed or if the mission to restore Jerusalem was even possible. Nehemiah, with a heavy heart, knew that he could not allow the work to stop. He also knew that he could not let the morale of the people break. With that, he withdrew for a moment and went to pray. In this time of introspection, he remembered God's words, which had always guided him on his journey. Nehemiah knew that he needed to be more than just a physical leader. He had to be a spiritual leader, someone who inspired trust and renewed the people's hope. It was time to use his faith like never before. The first thing Nehemiah did was gather the leaders and the families working on the wall and invited them to come together in prayer. The Lord is our strength. We cannot stop now, for we are on the path He has laid out for us. The wall will be completed, and Jerusalem will be restored because God is with us, he said with unwavering faith. He knew that the work didn't depend only on physical effort, but on God's strength, which never fails. Despite Nehemiah's encouraging words, some were so affected by fear that, in secret, they began planning to flee. They believed it would be safer to return to their cities and leave the wall unfinished, thinking their personal lives were at greater risk than the collective work. Others, terrified by the rumors of an imminent attack, started seeking safe places to hide. Nehemiah was faced with a dilemma. How could he prevent the people from quitting? How could he help them see that strength and hope would come from God, not from their own abilities? Nehemiah did not hesitate. He called the men still committed to the project and said, "We cannot abandon God's work. We began rebuilding Jerusalem, and this is how it will be restored. We cannot look back now." To set an example, Nehemiah positioned himself with the workers and began working alongside them, digging and placing the stones of the wall with his own hands. Seeing their leader so dedicated and committed, many of the workers hesitated to give up. Nehemiah was not just speaking, he was acting. At the same time, Nehemiah took drastic measures to increase the city's security and protect the work. He ordered swords, spears, and bows to be distributed to the men, and each one was to be prepared to defend themselves in case the enemies attacked. Furthermore, he organized the workers into shifts. While some worked on the wall, others stood. Watch, keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. This action not only provided more security to the people, but also renewed everyone's confidence, as they were now more united than ever. However, the greatest test was about to occur. One night, while everyone was on guard, a messenger arrived with an alarming message. Sanballat, aware of the fragility of the moment, had sent an ultimatum to Nehemiah. He wanted a secret meeting with the leader of Jerusalem. It was said that he wanted to make a peace agreement and avoid conflict, but Nehemiah knew he could not trust the enemy's intentions. He knew it was a trap to lure him out of his position and weaken the morale of the people. What would Nehemiah do now? He found himself facing a tough choice. The fear of a direct confrontation with Sanballat and his allies was in the air, but Nehemiah, with his wisdom and discernment, refused the invitation for the meeting. He replied firmly, "I am engaged in a great work. I cannot go." Nehemiah did not let himself be deceived, knowing that any distraction at this moment could jeopardize everything. The threats and temptations continued, but Nehemiah and the people remained unshaken. He led the reconstruction with strength, perseverance, and faith, becoming not only a military leader, but also a spiritual one. His example inspired others to not give in to fear, but to trust in God, even in the hardest of times. As Nehemiah faced both external and internal pressures, a new wave of challenges emerged. Sanballat and Tobiah had not given up, and their tactics were becoming more dangerous. But the big question was, how much longer could Nehemiah hold on? Would trust in God be enough to overcome all the obstacles still to come? This video will reveal a secret that could change the entire history of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The pace of the construction of Jerusalem's walls had intensified. Nehemiah had restored the morale of the people, facing fear, doubt, and constant opposition. However, a new and terrible challenge was about to test everyone's determination. In an even deeper way, Sanballat and Tobiah, frustrated with the progress of the work and the growing unity among the Jews, did not give up their attempts to destroy Nehemiah's mission. But now, their actions were about to become even more treacherous. Sanballat, realizing that direct military threats were not effective, began to use more subtle and devious tactics. He knew that Nehemiah was completely focused on rebuilding the walls and that any distraction could be fatal for the mission. So, he sought a different approach. Instead of confronting Nehemiah directly with external forces, he tried to shake him emotionally by attacking his integrity and his confidence in what he was doing. It was then that a new messenger arrived, to Nehemiah bringing a letter from Sanballat. The letter, however, was not an open threat, but a trap of manipulation. The content said that Sanballat wanted Nehemiah to go to the city of Ono to discuss a possible peace agreement. "Come, Nehemiah, let's resolve this once and for all without further destruction," the messenger said with an ironic smile. Upon reading the letter, Nehemiah immediately felt a sense of distrust. He knew something was wrong. He knew that Sanballat did not want a peace agreement, but instead to lure him out of the city, away from the safety and the walls, and then attack him. The question was, how could he convince the other leaders that this was not just a tactic to weaken the city? How could he show the people that he could not leave and risk the whole project for a false promise of peace? Nehemiah, with deep wisdom, decided not to fall into the trap. He did not respond immediately, but reflected on the situation. Meanwhile, the people continued with their work. Some, worried about the situation, began to suggest that Nehemiah go to Sanballat. They were tired of living under the constant threat of war, and the chance to negotiate seemed tempting. Nehemiah then called a meeting with the city's leaders and said with conviction, "I know what is happening. They do not want peace. They want me to leave and weaken them. We cannot give in now." He then wrote his response to Sanballat, declining the invitation and clarifying that he was too busy to leave the city. "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down to where you are. And why should I stop what I am doing to go meet you? There is no reason for it," he wrote. Nehemiah's response was as firm as his faith. He knew that if he left the city now, he would lose the respect of the people and their trust in the walls, which were almost complete. But Sanballat did not stop there. Unsatisfied with Nehemiah's refusal, he escalated the threats. He began spreading rumors throughout the city, saying that Nehemiah was planning to declare himself king of Jerusalem, and that by rebuilding the walls, he was preparing the city for a revolt against the Persian Empire. He sent letters to the regional rulers, trying to stir up distrust about Nehemiah. These rumors began to spread, creating even more pressure on Nehemiah. Now, he was not only facing the challenge of finishing the work, but also the challenge of his own reputation and the integrity of his intentions. Nehemiah knew this was yet another attempt at manipulation. They wanted him to give in, to do something reckless that would put him at a disadvantage. The situation was becoming more and more delicate. Pressures were mounting. Many began to ask whether it would be better to halt the work to avoid further conflict. That night, while everyone was resting, Nehemiah prayed again, seeking God's guidance. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but he knew he could not stray from the path that God had set for him. He needed to act with wisdom and courage, without allowing the lies of his enemies to take away his peace or confidence in his purpose. At dawn, Nehemiah gathered the people and reaffirmed his commitment to the work. He said to everyone, "We will not allow our enemies to divide us. No matter what they say or the threats we face, we are here to rebuild Jerusalem and honor God. Let's continue together until the end." However, as Nehemiah's and the people's trust grew stronger, he knew that Sanballat's last attempt would not be the final one. Something even more treacherous was coming. What could be worse than direct attacks, manipulations, or rumors spread throughout the city? Nehemiah knew that to protect the people and the work, he would need more than just courage. He would need divine help, a bolder plan, and the unshakable firmness he had already demonstrated. As the tension mounted and Nehemiah's enemies closed in, a new and dangerous strategy was about to be revealed. Sanballat and Tobiah were playing their most dangerous game, and Nehemiah would be tested in ways he never imagined. But would he be able to resist the final temptation? Next, we will discover Sanballat's final plan and how Nehemiah once again stood firm in the face of adversity. The atmosphere in Jerusalem was growing more and more tense. Nehemiah knew that his enemies would not give up easily. Sanballat and Tobiah, frustrated by their inability to weaken the people's resolve, were starting to play their final card. After attempting to corrupt Nehemiah with promises of peace, slandering his leadership, and even sowing distrust about his intentions, they were now planning one last, riskier trap: the direct defamation of Nehemiah through a false prophet. Nehemiah had been working tirelessly to finish the task. The walls were rising brick by brick, and the city was filled with a renewed spirit. But the threats kept coming. As a leader, he knew that his mission was more than just rebuilding walls. He was restoring the hope of the people of Jerusalem. But what he didn't know was that his enemies had found a weakness in his trust. They were going to attack his faith and try to destroy his mission from within. The news of Sanballat's new strategy reached Nehemiah through a messenger who appeared to be someone trustworthy. However, when the man delivered the message, Nehemiah immediately sensed that something was wrong. The letter stated that the prophet Shemaiah had sent an urgent warning. "Nehemiah, the danger is real. Your enemies are about to come in great numbers to attack the city. The only thing that can save you now is to seek refuge in the temple. If you run there and hide, they won't be able to harm you." The letter suggested that Nehemiah should take refuge in the temple, an action that sounded like a protective measure, but was, in fact, a trick to destroy his reputation. Nehemiah knew that the temple was a sacred place, a place where only priests were allowed to enter. He also knew that, as a leader, His mission was not to seek personal safety, but to protect the people. By entering the temple, he would be showing fear, that he no longer trusted in God's protection, and that he was abandoning his responsibility to be a firm and resolute leader. It was at that moment that he understood the trap. His enemies wanted him to make a mistake. They wanted him to hide so they could discredit him in the eyes of the people. Knowing that this was a snare, Nehemiah ignored the message and made a crucial decision. He went directly to the people, gathering all the city leaders in a large meeting. He looked each of them in the eyes and said, "This is the moment when our character will be tested. Sanballat and Tobiah are not just trying to destroy the walls, but also our courage. We cannot let our fears turn us away from what God has called us to do. The mission is not just mine, it is ours. We will not fail." The tension was in the air, and many were divided. Some were still frightened by the external threats and wanted to hear more from the prophet Shemaiah, while others trusted Nehemiah's words. He stood firm and said, "We cannot run now. We will do what is right and trust in God. There is no place safer than here, doing the work He has given us to do." Despite the pressure, Nehemiah was categorical. He knew that true victory did not come from fleeing or avoiding problems, but from standing firm and being courageous in the face of challenges. The people united in a great movement of renewal of commitment to rebuild the city, and together they decided to move forward, ignoring the threats from their enemies. But as Nehemiah prepared to continue with the work, he felt that something was still to come. He knew that his enemies would not give up so easily. Sanballat and Tobiah were still lurking, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. And what would come next would be the ultimate test for Nehemiah's mission. Would he be able to resist one more assault, or would he finally face an obstacle too difficult to overcome? As the wall continued to grow, the people of Jerusalem were growing stronger in faith and determination. But the final attempt from their enemies was about to be unleashed in an unexpected way. What would Sanballat and Tobiah's next move be? To try to destroy Nehemiah's mission. He was prepared for what lay ahead, but the greatest challenge of all was still to come, testing his faith and commitment in ways he never imagined. Nehemiah's mission was about to be completed. But the enemies of God always have the last word. The wind blew strongly over the walls of Jerusalem, but nothing could shake the determined spirit of Nehemiah and the people. After so many attempts at destruction and despair, they were finally witnessing the realization of their work. The walls were complete, imposing, and unbreakable, protecting the city and restoring the confidence of a people who had been marked by years of suffering and oppression. But as Nehemiah looked at the newly constructed walls, he knew that the true mission was not just to raise walls, but to restore the dignity and hope of a people who had been devastated. He remembered the difficult times, the threats from his enemies, the intrigues, and the lies that almost destroyed everything. He remembered the nights he stayed awake, praying for wisdom, and the times he felt the pressure of being the leader. But he never gave in. It was then that he felt a deep peace, a sense that his mission was complete. The resistance against enemies, the difficulties, the attacks, and the threats, all had been overcome with faith, courage, and determination. The wall was more than just finished. It was now a symbol of God's victory, the strength of the people of Jerusalem, and Nehemiah's faithfulness. However, even in the face of victory, Nehemiah knew that the work was not finished. He had not built the wall just to protect the physical city, but to prepare the hearts of the people. The true construction that needed to be done was spiritual, and that involved the restoration of faith, worship, and community life. It was no longer enough to have a safe city. The people needed to return to the path of God. So, Nehemiah called for a great assembly. He gathered the leaders, the priests, and all the men and women of Jerusalem to meet in the square. And at that moment, something incredible happened. Nehemiah asked for the book of the law of Moses to be brought, and the priest Ezra began reading it aloud to everyone as the people listened attentively. The words of God touched the hearts of all, and tears began to fall from their faces. Repentance and renewal were beginning, and the city was finally being restored from the inside out. Nehemiah watched with a satisfied smile as the people knelt, confessed their sins, and renewed their covenant with God. The mission had been fulfilled. The physical work was completed, but the true work, the one that touched the heart and soul of each person, was just beginning. He knew that no matter how much he had given of himself, the real transformation came from a people united by faith, not just by the strength of the walls they had built. The people of Jerusalem were finally at peace. The city was protected, and the heart of each person was restored. Nehemiah had completed his mission, not only as a leader, but as someone who had shown the people the true meaning of perseverance, faith, and trust in God. And so ends the story of Nehemiah, a story of unwavering courage, faith, and dedication. But did you know that the true lesson of Nehemiah lies within each one of us? He teaches us that even in the face of the greatest challenges, we must never give up on our mission. With faith, courage, and trust in God, we can rebuild our lives, our families, and our dreams, no matter the obstacles that come our way. Now, I want to hear from you. What was the greatest lesson you learned from Nehemiah's story? How can this story change the way you approach the challenges in your life? Leave your thoughts in the comments and share this video with your friends. If you were inspired by Nehemiah's story, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to not miss the next videos, and continue this journey with us. Let's keep growing together in faith and determination, just as Nehemiah did. Remember, never underestimate the power of faith and perseverance. Your mission may be great, but with God by your side, there is nothing you cannot conquer. See you in the next video.